Welcome to another episode of California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Shekhar. I'm the founder and CEO of Insta Mortgage, and I'm super excited to be joined by a guest who needs no introduction in the mortgage or the entrepreneurial world, but just in case you did not know Patty Arvielo, she is the co-founder and president of New American Funding. In 2016, she was Entrepreneur of the Year. And in 2020, she was named Top 10 Corporate Latina Executive of the Year. So welcome to the show, Patty.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure, of course. So I can talk about, I don't know, a dozen different topics with Patty, and I'm sure she will add a huge amount of value to all those conversations. But this is the DE&I podcast. So we want to hear more about what she herself is doing and what her company is doing in the diversity and inclusion. But before we get into the details, just as your life philosophy, Patty, because I see that a lot in terms of you mentoring and helping, especially minorities and women. What is your life philosophy around helping those in need or those considered minority?
So great question. I'm often asked about my role in mentorship. Listen, I wouldn't be where I am today if it weren't for mentorship. Whether I knew my mentor or not, I needed somebody that I resonated with so that I could emulate, especially in business, right? Especially being a female in business. It was really hard to navigate 30 years ago, 40 years ago, actually, when I entered in the mortgage career. We would show up to work trying to dress like men, act like men. So, for me, finding a mentor was critical. I think now in this point in time in my life, I've been doing mortgage for 41 years, and my significance comes from growth and other people's successes. So it's like I have all these women mentees that are like my children now. So if you can imagine, if you have children and how they make you feel, they give back to me more than I give to them, because I had one the other day came up to me at an event I spoke at, and she's like, when I first met you or met this organization that I'm involved with, I was making $19,000 a year as a Latina. She goes, and I'm going to make $900,000 this year.
Wow.
So that's like tremendous impact. And I think especially being raised Latina in a culture that's very prevalent in our country, there's very few role models for us, being the culture we're from, being one of the largest percentage of the population. We have very little representation in business and in media. So I think it's important for me to speak, even though I'm not confident all the time in the words that I choose to speak with, but I felt like it's better for me to speak than not speak at all.
No, totally makes sense. And you're right, you're making a world of difference to, especially within the community where they may not have as many role models as some of the other communities might have. Let's talk specifically about diversity and inclusion and a little bit of minority homeownership. Other than New American Funding, which is your baby, and you are the co-founder there. You have been on several committees with Mortgage Bankers Association, with Freddie Mac, with Fannie Mae on affordable housing and minority ownership. Tell us about the common theme between some of those committees, and what is it that you're trying to achieve by being part of it?
So I started doing loans in the Hispanic community in roughly 1994. And I did it out of need, right? It was very similar to a market that we're in right now. Yeah. So hunting for purchases was critical. And I realized that the town next to me, Santa Ana, California, was primarily Latino. So I'm like, well, I speak pretty good Spanish, so I'm going to go and ask realtors for loans and let them know that I'm bilingual. So my branch was doing very, very well in comparison to most branches at Countrywide. So I didn't really know that what I was doing or fell into, because I love, we all love to be around similar people like us, right? Whether female, male, Latina, whatever it is, we love to be around people that understand us. So it was very exciting for me to be able to make an impact in that market. At that very moment, when Angelo Muzzillo realized that there was a business case for lending in the Hispanic community, I then realized that a passion I had to serve my community was also a business case around it. So, I think the conversations have been very similar since 1994. So I do sit on many, many boards, and I actually become quite frustrated, to be perfectly honest with you, because we're still talking about the same things we've been talking about since 1994. So when I hear the phrase, "Oh, we're going to get into Hispanic lending," I'm like, okay, really? Because we represent like the 7th largest GDP in the world.
Yeah.
We're tied with France, where we have a bigger GDP than Canada. If you are a business person and you're not focusing on that, that's simple business to me, right? But I think really overall, I would tell you right now that the Biden administration came in really strong to make an impact. And what's holding banks and IMBs back is regulation. The regulators that oversee what we do as a business to serve these communities don't really understand our business. So I think it's quite frustrating for me. So I started a road trip probably early February to go meet with pretty much every head of every organization that oversees mortgage lending, not just for my company. Obviously, I do a large percentage of lending to minority communities, but really to help the industry overall. Because, if I do that, then the greater impact to me is even greater, because a larger percentage of my business goes to that market. We need to teach CFPB. We need to educate HUD. We need to educate state regulators on what pricing looks like to these communities, what programs look like to these communities, what pricing adjustments look like to these communities. So, that they're not setting a tone of fear for doing these types of loans. And so I don't blame my competition. I don't blame Wells Fargo. I don't blame any of them for pulling away. It's simply not in alignment with regulation.
Yeah, you mentioned two really important things. One, you tried to lay the case for business to focus on Hispanic community, and Urban Institute a year or two back came up with the data that over the next 20 years, we'll have 6.9 million net homeowners, out of which 4.8 million will be Hispanic. So if my math is right, that's about 70%. And again, if everyone's math is right, that's a huge amount of net homeowners that we are talking. So it's not just the fact that, yes, we are helping them build generational wealth, which only homeownership can, but also there's a business case to be doing that, because if you don't focus on that market, you'll be left behind. The second thing that you mentioned, Patty, is the fact that the men tend to work with men, women tend to work with women, Hispanic. So it's more a question of, does that person look familiar to you? And that's one of the first things that the companies can do, is have a team that looks like the community you want to serve. So tell us a little bit more about it, because you have been at the forefront of it. And you have, I'm sure you hear from other business leaders about the challenges of working with the community. But one of the basic things that they can do is just have more people who look and talk like the people that they want to serve. So what are some of the early things that you did within your business and your company, and how can others learn from it?
So when Rick and I first started New American Funding, we were primarily a call center. We didn't have distributed retail or branches. And this was 2000 or late 90s. And I ran a $2 ad in the Penny Saver, which is a throwaway paper, because our phones were ringing off the hook, because we just simply put "Se habla español" on the mailer. And we're like, oh my God, I could not handle all the, Spanish leads coming in and the English leads, because I was there was only 2 loan originators at the time for Rick. It was me and my girlfriend. So I ran a $2 ad, and I said, we're looking for Spanish speaking loan officers. Well, very few responded, because there was really not a lot of them in the business. Well, Frank Fuentes, who still today is with New American Funding, answered that ad. And I recruited him way back when to come work for New American Funding. So it was very organic and very purpose driven, right? I needed somebody who looked like the communities we were serving. Even though I needed additional breadth there. So I was very purposeful, must speak Spanish, must understand the Hispanic market. So I think where everybody wants to overcomplicate, diversity and inclusion, it's simply choosing and making an effort to pick. I still, as a woman leader in this industry, have to jump up and down to be chosen to do pilot programs with, to align with other male dominated banks to, I'm like, look at me, and I
Yeah.
think that there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that business leaders, especially males, I see the lens through people, right? I walk their walk. I don't judge. Even as a white male leader owning an IMB today, which the majority are white male, I understand.
Mhm.
I understand that it's a little hard when their entire, C-suite is men, because they purposely now have to go search for a woman. And what does that look like? It's a little uncomfortable, but we always want the best person to run our companies and lead our companies. But I guarantee you, if you look, there's an equal woman to an equal man and
Yes.
vice versa. So just choose us. Like, let's just throw in an extra flavor there. So it's being purposeful is really inorganic in your approach. There's nothing to be uncomfortable about saying that, listen, I need an African-American leader. I needed an African-American leader, right? So, yeah, I was organic in my approach to that as well, even at NAF. And that was only in 2016 when we started our initiative in the Black communities. I needed to be very purposeful and organic and honest that I may not know how you feel, but I have empathy and I'm learning and I understand. Like, I understand your immigrant perspective in comparison to my mom. So I think learning cultural differences in this country is critical, especially if you run a company. Black culture, very different than Latino culture, right? But we're big, powerful cultures in this country.
Yeah, and just purely going back to that data, if 72 or about 70% of net home ownership is coming from Hispanic, about 17% will come from Black home ownership. So practically, I mean, that's almost 90% of net new homeowners in the next 2 decades. And you said something very, very powerful, is that if your entire C-suite looks like white male right now, then you have to make that uncomfortable decision. And it's not always because the fact that you don't like working with other people of color or women. It's just the fact that you haven't done it in the past. So it might be uncomfortable in the beginning, but that's a journey we all have to take at some point in life, because that's good for community and that's good for the business. So let's talk about some of the commitments that New American Funding has made towards minority homeownership, especially Hispanic homeownership. Let's talk about what kind of commitments have you made going into the future, and how does New American Funding plan to deliver on those commitments?
So we made a commitment at NAREP at the convention, I believe it's been pre-pandemic, to have 25 billion of our efforts go towards Latino homeownership or Latino lending. But again, I will tell you, the way we do it is by recruiting Latinos with zero experience to come in as call center, like trainee type junior. Then they trainees, just like, okay, this is a loan. This is what you're doing. This is what people are going to say. We have a step-by-step training process at NAF, but we do make a purposeful recruiting effort to recruit both Latino and African-American college students from HBCUs. I mean, I know we had Taco Bell Latinos at NAV. I mean, they're like, oh my God, I never knew about lending. I didn't know about home loans, because what people don't know, we border all Latin countries for the most part, right? Primarily Latin countries. Well, to own a home is nearly impossible in most Latin countries, especially Mexico. So when they learn that they can have a piece of our dirt and own it, that's where the passion comes from. I walked New American Funding yesterday. I was at our corporate office in California, and I was going to go film a video, and I'm walking up the hallways where all the trainees sit. There wasn't one non-minority that I walked past. And I can't tell you how happy that made me feel, because I was that person that fell into mortgage like most of us, right? I thought I was going to be a dental hygienist, and all of a sudden I fell into mortgage, and I'm like, what? There's no cap in income. There's no ceiling here. So, I think it's so important for this population in our country to realize that there is opportunity in our industry. I mean, we have one of the best industries in America to earn wealth. I mean, it is, right? It doesn't come without hardships. We're all enduring some hardships right now, especially loan originators. But it's created a life that I never thought I would ever live. So I try to tell that story to the young minority employees that we're hiring at NAF. But we do have a mission to recruit. in those communities, because we see the data that you just spoke about. We've been looking at that data for 10 years. I
I'm
mean,
sure.
yeah,
Yes.
you look just the makeup of our country. So Rick and I always say, go back to your broker shop, your IMB, your bank, pull up the data and see what your lending is to all communities.
Mhm.
And it just better match the percentage of the population. So if Blacks represent 14%, your lending to the Black community should be 14%.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And it's, as you rightly mentioned, it's one of the very few professions, I can only think of 2 or 3 right now, where you personally can make all that wealth that you just mentioned. But you're not just making wealth for yourself, but you're changing generations, as we talked about. Nothing creates the kind of generational wealth that homeownership does, right? I mean, I'm
Right.
sure a lot of our audience has looked at the data, is that a homeowner, especially within a Hispanic homeowner, has 26 times more net worth than say a renter homeowner. So you're not just doing this to make commission on this one home that you're able to help them get into, but you're really helping them build, changing the generations, not just one generation, but multiple future generations to come. So that's, you can be passionate about it, you can be very involved in it, and still make a lot of money. So you're doing an amazing job bringing those people from college, where they practically know nothing about how to do mortgages, where you were at one point of time. What is I mean, you talked about regulators a little bit, and we know the new administration has kind of a newfound energy into bringing minority homeownership. What can company leaderships do? A lot of audience for a podcast like this are company leaders, IMB leaders, broker leaders. What can they do? I mean, New American Funding is pledging 25 billion. Of course, a lot of people can look at that and say, we can never get there.
Yeah.
So what's the point trying? But in your experience, you were not there, say, 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years ago. What can they do now to play a big role into minority homeownership and bringing, say, diversity and inclusion into their team?
Right. It's just coming up with a plan. I think everybody right now is mission purposed, right? A lot of the younger millennials that we're hiring at NAF, everybody that's growing a company today in the US needs to have a purpose. These younger generations that are entering the workforce, which primarily a large percentage of them are Latinos, they want to work for companies that mean more than just a paycheck. So, everybody knows what we're rooted in. And it doesn't mean that sometimes I don't have uncomfortable conversations when I'm talking about women empowerment, knowing that 43% of my company are not women, right? They're men. So I got over that just by data. So I think that just sitting around the coffee, have a cup of coffee in the morning, whether you have 2 employees, 100, 1,000, there should be a purpose and a mission to serving communities of color, because like you said, there's the business case for it too. But not only that, there's no competition. NAF doesn't have competition in this space. We're talking about an underserved community here. So we may be leading the efforts because you have a Latina leader, but there's plenty of room. And I think that that's really what it needs to come down to. Is this something that you can find passion in? Because it's not really something that we're going to force anybody to do. At least I don't believe that. There's some legislation that forced certain public companies to have women on their boards, and everybody came to you. How do you feel about that? Like, well, I kind of want to be chosen.
Yes, exactly.
I want you to have to be a part of your company or your board. I want you to see the value in my voice. And so I think it's just really something that every company should be talking about, in finding their passion to serve communities of color in our country and learning about our cultures. I mean, fundamentally, it's so easy. I do videos at NAF and I teach people how to be culturally centric. I'm like, go this weekend. I want you to go and watch a primarily 100% Black casted movie.
Yeah.
How simple is that?
Yeah.
I had so many white employees go, oh my God, Patty, I've never turned on a movie that was primarily Black cast. And they found these great movies that they had never, chosen to pick on Netflix or whatever. To me, that's what's fun. I don't want to sit and watch a bunch of movies about people that look like me or sound like me. I want to see, there's actually, I do Indian culture, Black culture, whatever it is. To me, that's exciting. So I teach that, like, let's just be a little more cultural sensitive and cultural knowledgeable. And then you'll find your passion. It's pretty fun. It's pretty fun to be different, I think.
It is, and it makes you very interesting conversationalist, so to say, is because when it happens to me a lot of times is that I will come across someone who's like, oh, just watched a Bollywood movie or something, and then they will have that cultural nuances. And the good thing is that we live in a country where all of this is possible. You can go to a restaurant that serves another food. You can watch, as you mentioned, you can watch a Netflix movie or a series that's in a different language and culture. And there's so much you can learn, which was very hard, I would say, about 10, 15, 20 years back when
Yeah.
we did not have these options. Now, changing lane here, you also work a lot on women empowerment, Patty. And women empowerment somehow is kind of tied again to home ownership. Single females accounted only for 6-7% of home ownership about 20 years back. They have jumped rapidly. I mean, they're one of the fastest growing demographics, so to say, at about 16-17% of all home ownership. What's fueling that? How come single males have stayed in low single digits, and that has stayed almost the same number? If anything, they have actually gone down a little bit over the last 20 years. But single females seem to be doing very well with home ownership. What's going on there, and where do you see the future of that?
Well, it's the same. It's the same case for Latino lending is, really being aware of what women are doing to rise career-wise, right? Wealth-wise. It was a tough word for women to say a long time ago, I want to be rich. Mainly we were taught to rely on men for that. Oh, I'm going to marry a rich man. I mean, that was the narrative 50 years ago. That narrative is non-existent today. Really, it's not anything I hear. And so we're just we're the emerging, I think at my age, I'm probably the first generation of self-made wealth builders for a woman. I'm pushing 60. So my children now see moms like myself, who they have role models that look like them, sound like them. And quite honestly, how could we rely on men to support us in most parts of this country? I mean, to buy a house in Southern California, So I think there's a lot of good coming from this, but it's women empowerment because we're here and we've never not been here. It's just that we're in the workforce now and we're finding our voices and we're finding our strength and we're being acknowledged and we're being chosen. It doesn't go without saying that we have many more obstacles than men, right? We give birth to the world population. We have to make choices men don't have to make for the most part. Some men have to make some of the same choices. Our bodies are used to create, living creatures, yet we have to go back to work after 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, there's so much work to be done in our space. So me speaking out, just about what it's been like my career, I think is really important, but we're buying more because we're making more, right? We're making more money and we're graduating college at a quicker pace than men. So I think it's just going to continue to emerge. And like I said, if we want equality, we should have equality. There are some women that are perfectly happy being at home, being at stay-at-home moms. I champion them too. It's the hardest job in the world. It's the hardest job in the world.
Yeah, the future is female for sure. I mean, as rightly mentioned, 57% of university graduates are female now compared to only 43, which the number which keeps rising. And Pew Research came up with some data recently where women finally, after, I don't know, thousands of years, are finally catching up to pay disparity. And there are some metro market where they're actually just slightly above some of the male graduates. So those are all encouraging signs, which means if they were already showing that kind of homeownership rate, if anything, those numbers should ideally be going up, even with all the challenges that you mentioned for the women. So definitely looking forward to that world where the minority is majority. And of course, New American Funding and you are playing a huge role into that. Any final thoughts for the audience? Somebody who's struggling around the concept of diversity inclusion, which includes minority homeownership in the mortgage terms. How should they go about it? I mean, for me, I think it's a lot of culture mindset, a lot of just change in mindset. There's not really much you have to do, as we talked about. There are a few small things that you can take that first step, but just some initial thoughts for those people who might still be struggling to get on that path.
Yeah. So, like I said, it's as simple as watching one of our TV shows.
Yeah.
And it's really simple and acknowledging. I always, when I speak in a public forum to non-Latinos, which I often speak to Latinas, about, being a woman of this culture in our country. But I always say, everybody in the audience who's not a Latina, after I'm done speaking, you're going to want to be part of my club. It's finding the love for our country. I mean, we are a country that is made up of immigrants. We always have been.
Mhm.
And just furthermore, we happen to border Hispanic countries. That's why we're a larger percentage. If we bordered Italy, there'd be more Italians than Hispanics, you
Yeah.
know? I think finding the love, but really for the finding the business case, look at the data and have goals in your company to, at the very least, be lending to each demographic, Asian as well, to the population. I'm working on Asian at NAF, right? My number one LO, female LO in the country is Asian, but yet it's somewhere where I'm really having to double down on my focus, like I did when I went into lending to the African American communities. I really had to make a focus on it and pull everybody in my team together and said, I need you to help me. And there was nothing wrong with that. I wanted them to empower me.
Very well said. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Patty Arvielo, co-founder and president at New American Funding. This is your host, Shashank Shekhar, and this was California Mortgage Bankers Association Diversity and Inclusion Podcast, brought to you by Prime Lending. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode.